Hi everyone, welcome to the second talk that I'm delivering here at the Australian College for Mental Health Nursing Conference 2024. This talk is called So Now We Know Experiences Shape Brains, So What? Let's chat about the neuroplastic narrative. So last year I presented this theory, it's called the neuroplastic narrative. I presented it at this conference. And what this theory does is it moves us away from pathologizing narratives towards ecological narratives. So it's a theory of adaptation, how we biologically adapt to the environments that we are immersed in, really. It's a consumer narrative, but it's also informed by my experience of doing a PhD and a master's in molecular neuroscience, and also being a mental health nurse. So today I'm going to talk about Let's Chat, which is an acronym that's come out of the neuroplastic narrative. But in case you didn't see this talk, which of course many of you wouldn't have, I'm just going to go through the outline of it so what I'm saying makes some sense or put some context around it. So what we kind of need to keep in mind, this is an ecological framework that's appreciative of diversity between different kinds of brains. All right? Brains are specialised. They are the organs of adaptation. It's how they coordinate us to survive and thrive in the world, and they do so by anticipating relevant threats and opportunities, which they have information from because of our past threats and opportunities. So experiences are like data. And much of that data is acquired very, very early in life that subsequently shapes our perceptions and the way that we interpret moving forward. So perception is very much an act of interpretation. So the best way to think about it probably is that we anticipate our future experiences from the past experiences that we've had. So if there have been many threats in the past, then we're going to anticipate threat in the future. If there have been many opportunities in the past, we're going to anticipate those sort of similar kinds of opportunities in the future. So the past is a generator of what we anticipate in our future. But I'm going to run through these three questions. How do we adapt? What do we adapt to? And why do we adapt? So you get a fuller idea of what the neuroplastic narrative is. So firstly, how do we adapt? Well, we adapt through these neuroplastic mechanisms. They are epigenetics, neurogenesis, synaptic plasticity and white matter plasticity, and that's not an exhaustive list. There's also the things that erode telomeres, but that's all for another day. But these evolved neuroplastic mechanisms, they're survival positive because we've evolved quite a lot of them, so they must help us to survive and reproduce, get our genes into the next generation. And what they do is they transduce the experiences that we have lived through under our skin, right? So they transduce it into biology that goes under our skin, shapes our immune system, shapes our stress system, shapes all of our systems, but it also shapes the very structure and function of our brain. And what it shapes it for, or what it calibrates it for, is it calibrates it sort of from and for more of those same kinds of experiences. So that's that idea of anticipation that I was just talking about. So anyone who's seen me present before will have seen this slide. I talk about neuroplasticity as the capacity that neural systems have to adapt, like that's kind of what they're for. And the best way I think of thinking about neuroplasticity is with this water metaphor. So think of experiences as being like raindrops. So no particular raindrop stands out. The only way one particular experience might stand out is particularly if it's filled with a particular kind of affect. Terror, for example, would be an experience that really stands out because it's survival threatening. All right, so that would have a bigger impact than others. But for the most part, these experiences are the minutiae of our lives, the very, very minutiae of our lives. And they're repeated over and over, like rain, just falls, lots and lots of raindrops. And rain collects at the lowest point and then travels down the path of least resistance, downhill. And what experiences do is they sort of fall sensory onto the surface of the brain, and they create these neural pathways, and then these experiences sort of run down these neural pathways, transfer down these neural pathways. And what we know about rain, of course, is it cuts out these channels. That means the next time it rains, there's already channels for it to go down. And the same with our brains, and this is how sort of perception is shaped by previous experience. Because if it looks like something that's already happened, then we're going to anticipate it or interpret it in that particular way, because there's already those channels for those experiences or neural pathways for those experiences to find their ways down. We know with water, like rivers are big bodies of water that flow. And what you find in the brain is that when there are neural pathways that are rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed, there's a lot of activity down those pathways. That promotes something called activity-dependent myelination. And activity-dependent myelination makes the transfer of the signal down that pathway faster and more efficient. And what we understand about rain is that it shapes the whole landscape. And what we need to understand about experience is that it shapes the landscape of our brains. It shapes the structure and function of our brains. So you can see that different experiences are going to lead to very different brains. I'll get onto that. So secondly, what do we adapt to? Well, we adapt to our ecological niche in its totality. And by this, I mean right from the get-go, when you emerge into the world, you have a relationship with a caregiver. The emotional tone of the kind of experiences you have in that relationship, the emotional tone of those sets a scene, right? That ecological niche is when you begin adapting to from the get-go. And then other people will come into that. So there'll be another caregiver probably. There'll be a family. There may be siblings. There may be pets. Who knows? But there'll be other kind of living beings in that ecological niche. And then around that too, there's the wider family, and then there's the community, and then there's the sort of social and cultural niche. So all of these things, these relationships and the emotional tone, all of that is included in what I'm calling our ecological niche. Really important to hold on to here that we adapt to whatever we get, right? We adapt to whatever we get, desirable and undesirable. We adapt differently because we come to anticipate different things, but our brain doesn't have a setting for these are terrible experiences, don't learn from them, and these are really good ones, learn from them. There's no homunculus up there making those decisions. You adapt to whatever you get. And so that brings us to this slide, and both of these brains, though very different, are both perfectly adapted to the ecological niche in which they were formed. It is the same neuroplastic mechanisms that have built different brains from different experiences, and they've done it differently because these brains need to survive in very different ecological niches. That doesn't make one of these brains better than the other. It doesn't make one of them healthy and one of them sick. One might have had some more desirable experiences than the other, but that doesn't give the one that's got more desirable experiences any claim on normality or health. Okay, and this then is neuroecological diversity, which my first presentation was about, which is also available. Lastly, the last question, why do we adapt? Well, we adapt to fit our ecological niche, and this is a Darwinian idea, and he didn't mean the most fit, like he's been at the gym the most. He meant fit as in hand in glove. How adapted to our ecological niche are we? Because when we are very adapted to that ecological niche in which we are going to mature and have our own children, pass on our genes, ensure the successful genetic line, we need to be very well fitted to our environment. So that's what that meant. This is that sort of Darwinian idea. And what emerges from that is that different strategies are successful in different ecological niches. And this brings us towards life history theory. I don't really have time to go into enormously, but here's a tiny tour of it. So the critical parameters that make environments differ from one another in evolutionary theory that have been, as far as we understand it, is harshness and unpredictability. And life history describes how the more harsh and unpredictable the environment is, the more evolution trades off one thing for another. So these are trade-offs. The more harsh and unpredictable the environment, the more evolution will trade off slow and stable development for earlier puberty. If you're in a harsh and unpredictable environment, you don't know how long you're going to be around, so you need to get on with these tasks of living, which is about your genetic line surviving, reproducing, so your genetic line survives as early as possible, because you don't know how long you're going to be around to be able to do that. You may be injured, you may be harmed, it may not be possible. So don't delay is what happens here. That's the contingency. The more harsh and unpredictable the environment, the more we trade off cognitive flexibility and a capacity to learn new things for protective, defensive, and more rigid routines. It's harder to give up safety behaviors than it is to learn new things, right? It's better to anticipate that the stick is a snake and take evasive action than it is to spend longer wondering about whether or not it's a stick and a snake, or in which case the snake can get you. All right, so these protective, defensive routines can be life-saving. So evolution trades this off too. Makes sense. The more harsh and unpredictable the environment, the more likely we are to, the more evolution trades off the conservation of resource for consumption of resource. So there's this, that you see this immediacy. There's no point conserving it if you don't know if it's going to be around tomorrow when you come back for it. Why would you conserve it under those circumstances of unpredictability and uncertainty about the safety of that resource? You're best off to consume it now while it's there. It's that kind of bird in the hand thing, right? The more harsh and unpredictable the environment, the more evolution trades off long-term goals for short-term gains. So, and I find this so interesting, that our experiences shape our sense of autonomy and agency in the world. So the way that we go about in the world, enacting our autonomy, being agents in the world, is shaped by the level of harshness and unpredictability we've had in our environment. We can, if we're in an environment that's predictable and safe, we can make plans, because you can make plans in an environment that's predictable, in an ecology that's predictable, but you can't make plans in a world where there's no rules, where anything can happen, where things can be snatched away, where you can't rely on the outcome of these plans. So you're much better off. It's the making hay while the sun shines there, right? It's carpe diem. It's that seize the day, as opposed to saving for a rainy day, if you like. And this is, again, another evolutionary contingency. So alongside that is this trade-off between parenting effort and mating effort. Parenting effort, what comes from that is fewer offspring that have had resources poured into them, so it makes them more competitive for fewer resources as adults, right? So over here, parenting effort, lots of effort into the parenting to make kind of quality competitive offspring. Whereas over here in this, potentially quite changeable environment, you're best off with a more hedging your bets strategy, having more children with a wider gene pool. So sometimes different parenting, different parents, and then you've got this hedging your bets strategy. So the breadth of capacity that you've got in that gene pool is wider to be able to accommodate these changes in the environment. So these are different strategies for different environments, and there's no judgment here. The trouble is we do attach judgment to these behaviours. And lastly, the trade-off is between health span and lifespan for reproductive effort, because it costs us, right? Reproductive activity, it costs us. It certainly costs women, because it's such a kind of biologically intense thing to do. So then what you end up with is what you see on the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, this trade-off between the longevity and health span for this kind of reproductive effort. So these are characterizations of slow life history and fast life history. And please hear me, I'm not making a judgment about this. I'm trying to describe evolutionary pressures and how they land for us, and how we might want to understand that and engage with it if we want to change outcomes for people. Okay. So we evolved these mechanisms of neuroplasticity. Evolution assumes that the ecological niche which we develop in is going to be the same or similar to the ecological niche in which we're going to find ourselves having children, surviving and reproducing in. So this realization, which is unsettling for those of us who were harmed in childhood, is that our brains are not only a reflection and a kind of a record of our ecological niche of development, but we're also likely to be perpetrators, or no, that's not the right word, perpetuators of the same or similar ecological niches, right? So we adapt to fit our environment, and then we become part of that environment. I spoke about this the other day. I think this might be a mechanism behind transgenerational trauma. So look, just as a quick sort of share, it would be, I left home at 15, right? Determined not to repeat the mistakes that my parents made with me, and I was in a lot of pain, and I resolved to make different kinds of choices. Now I haven't had children, so I certainly haven't reenacted some of those difficulties. But it's not that easy, right? You leave home, but what you take with you is a brain and a physiology that was still forged within that ecological niche. And surprisingly, it's not actually that easy, quite strangely, to adapt to a more benevolent ecological niche or to create a new one the way that you want it to be. You see this in children that are taken into foster care. It's not that easy to adapt to this new home with new rules or fairer rules or things being okay. It's not that easy. It happens to an extent, but it isn't an easy thing to do. So in this cartoon, the limitation here, which is represented by the goldfish bowl, you can be anything you want to be, no limits. And the irony is, of course, they're in a goldfish bowl. But the constraint that we have is that our brains were forged in the ecological niche of our development. So we can't just take on this kind of radical hope of you can just change to be anything you want to be. But what actually can we do? Well, firstly, one of the things that we can do is let go of these shaming and judgmental narratives that judge us or categorize us, particularly as mad or bad. Shaming anyone who already carries shame just fuels their self-destructive tendencies. It might work on some people when you want to change their behavior, but it is a very, very unpredictable way of trying to change behavior. You can make something worse for some people. So I'd invite you also to consider various shaming language: impairment, abnormal, sick, even phrases like self-sabotage. If you look underneath, self-sabotage carries a function. It can protect people from fears that they will again be disappointing or be disappointed or fail. And sometimes some of us, can be so fragile that being a disappointment, being a failure, sets off a tremendous and dangerous shame vortex. And it's better not to have that happen by this so-called active self-sabotage. So there can be something very self-preserving about that, even though it's quite a shaming way of talking about it. And I invite you instead, as shown by these raindrops again, to take up adaptive narratives, trauma-informed narratives, the neuroplastic narrative. Experiences shape brains, so what do we need? Well, new experiences that are going to shape our brains in the ways that we may desire to put us on trajectories we want to take forward. So I called it Let's Chat, quite like that, because I'm all about authentic engagement and conversation and relating. I think these are important things. And the acronym itself stands for compassion, hope, and agency in time. So firstly, appreciating that brains are neuroecologically diverse orientates us to compassion. So these two brains, as I've said before, they are different and they are both perfectly adapted to the ecology in which they were forged. One is more attentive and on the lookout for immediate threats and how to survive them, and the other is more attentive to future opportunities. And the reason that these orientations are different is because the experiences will have been different. So I've put up there a definition of neuroecological diversity. Differences between people's biological, psychological, and behavioural responses that arise as a consequence of their brains and physiologies having developed in diverse ecologies of development. So this premise of the neuroplastic narrative that our experiences shape our brains offers us compassion for our past, for experiences that cannot be changed and did shape our brains. And where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with this thought. It's not your fault. It wasn't your choice. You didn't consent to the way that your brain was shaped by the experiences it had, but it is your brain, right? It is your brain and therefore your responsibility. And I don't mean that in a kind of finger wagging way. I mean, it's your brain. You could take care of it better than anyone else can, even if it's such a seductive idea to think someone else can. It's kind of yours. So pick it up and let's see what we can do with it. Which takes me neatly into this idea, hope. The neuroplastic narrative's premise that experiences shape brains offers hope for our future. Where you can, we can choose new raindrops of experience to shape our brains to be on a trajectory that we might want to be on, or to adapt the trajectory that we are on, to mitigate it somehow. We can do that a little. Maybe not a lot, because that requires resources, but we can all do that a little. So what might help? Well, firstly, examine what you tolerate. Don't continue to stand in a shower of experiences that are harming you. Secondly, we've all got a bit of wriggle room. Use the wriggle room you have got to get the kinds of experiences you need. Someone left a comment under one of my YouTube videos saying it's all very well for her saying choose the experiences to shape your brain, but we don't all have those kinds of resources. That's right, we don't, right? I'm pretty well resourced. I spend a lot of my money and quite a lot of time in psychotherapy because it gives me the kinds of experiences that move me in a direction that I want to travel. So I quite awarely spend the money on that. But another thing that's helped me a lot is being in 12-step recovery programs. So for addiction and also for emotional and sort of reflection on relationships. So there's a wide variety of 12-step programs. Many of you know about them. One's for substance addiction, one's for process addiction, but there's also things like ACA and CODA, which are more about an awareness of your kind of emotional landscape and also how you relate. And you don't have to spend an awful lot of money on doing this, but they are gentle programs for awareness and accountability, and I fully recommend anyone having a look at them. So my point there, we've all got a bit of wriggle room. So start curating your experiences. And lastly, this one, we all need a bit of help. Find out what's helpful to you and who, and trust yourself in that. Curate your relationships, curate your experiences where you can. And just a heads up, there's a little star here, you can't fix relational trauma or betrayal trauma or loss by yourself. And wanting to is symptomatic of that betrayal trauma or relational trauma. Trust me, if I could have done it by myself, I would have done. And you can't fix it by yourself, because that's wanting to do it by yourself is already a symptom of having been let down in those ways. So we all need a bit of help. And then this idea that I find so interesting of how we experience our agency, or where our time horizons are. If we look at our decisions, and our decisions are about looking after the next 5 minutes, the next hour, or the next week, or the next month, if we're very, very immediacy focused, that might be something we want to look at. But also, if we're very, very future focused and we're so far into the future, or so caught up with these ideas of who we should be and what we should be like, that we are unable to be spontaneous in our present, well, that's another thing to look at. And I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do any of those things. This isn't mine to decide. This is yours to look at, right? But I've put this up here for people who, a bit like me in some areas of my life where life feels uncertain and you want to eat dessert first, well, maybe slow yourself down by saying something like, don't give up what you want most for what you want now. Another way of looking at time horizons is to think about how you, what you do with things that have hurt you. Is your focus towards blame? Is it towards the past, things that can't be changed? You spend a lot of time in blame. You spend a whole lifetime in blame, looking at what you've done, how you've reacted, other people, all of these things that absolutely cannot be changed. But by the time you finish blaming, right, nothing's changed. You're still alive and there's still all these problems. So I've discovered being oriented to accountability is a place where I'd rather live. So then I'm looking at what can be changed, and neuroplasticity, right? Things can change. I don't know how much, no, but I do know that I would rather be orientated towards change and possibility than not, even when there's no guarantee of what can be changed. Psychotherapy, any kind of therapy, reflective practices allow us to change the narratives that we have. Narrative therapy is quite good at doing this too, and that's a way of making sense of things that might be a more helpful way of making sense of things for our futures. So this is Homer Simpson. The caption here is, that's a problem for future Homer. Man, I don't envy that guy. And I'll just let you watch this little clip. But here we have Homer being totally in the present, hence his bottle of vodka and jar of mayonnaise. And you have Marge, who is the future focused person in the relationship at this moment. And she's saying, are you sure? And he's saying, that's a problem for future Homer. Man, I don't envy that guy.
Peckham.
That's a problem for future Homer. Man, I don't envy that guy.
So just to summarize, I've been talking to you today about the neuroplastic narrative and this acronym that's come out of it called Let's Chat. Now, the premise of the neuroplastic narrative is that experiences shape brains, and they do so in meaningful ways. And when we really think about what that means, experiences shape brains, well, that gives us compassion for our past, okay? We can't do anything about it. Experiences shaped us, and that's where we start from, right? Can't do anything about it. So compassion for your past. But with that, it's not your fault, and it wasn't your choice, but it is your brain, and it is your responsibility. And secondly, our experiences shape our brains. This is good. This is good news. It gives us some wriggle room, so we can have some hope. Where we can choose new raindrops of experience to shape us on the trajectory that we want to be on more than the one that we might be on now. And lastly, this idea of agency in time and how our experiences shape our sense of agency, which again is malleable. We might want to become more present focused if we're very much in the future. We might want to become more future focused if we're very, very caught up with the present. It's a very anxiety provoking place to live, constantly in the present. It's like you're always on your guard, always very anxious. And the take home for me for that one is don't give up what you want most for what you want now. So here is a video. It's called Better Days. It's a rap by Baba Brinkman, and it's based on the neuroplastic narrative. So that's going to be edited in, so I'll just pause.
I learned to expect the worst as a child, trying to survive as a child. But now it's time to relearn. Now the better days have arrived.
Girl, you had a tough life. I see you dealing with it. Invisible, adverse childhood experiences. A backwards facing handful of aces trapped in the basement. Slaps instead of embraces. Anticipation. Drama begets drama. A biological expectation of trauma, not karma. Just an internal thermostat that tracks danger. Calibrated at our internal working model of what to expect from the people you should look to for love and respect. Family first, but when it doesn't protect you, links begin to form between trust and regret. Invisible girl living in the midst of a swirl of difficulties in an unpredictable world with limited resources. You can't choose the genes you were born with, and you can't choose the scenes your first impressions were formed in. External forces shriveled the sense of agency in your cortex. Short fuse cut short by a few shortages. Can't see the future or how to transform it.
I turn my world brighter. Now the better days have arrived. Oh, I turn my world brighter. Now the better days have arrived.
Girl, you got set up. Fast life history. Doctors bring in pills to fix chemistry and talk about mental illnesses and disease. But when they told you that you're sick, what a relief. Diagnosed with multiple anxiety disorders, depression, personality on the border, bricks and mortar laid in torrential rain, landscaping terrain, deprivation and pain, quick to rage. But that trigger isn't a choice. Did it come from today or the subconscious void, or something from an ancestral humanoid? Either way, flooded with glucocorticoids, and that's okay. By design, fight or flight, evolutionarily adaptive. It's quite alright, I'm not here to choose what's wrong from a menu. I'm just here to validate all that you've been through. You face challenges known to do damage. It's no shame behaving like a wounded mammal if you are one. And where predators strive, the paranoid rabbit is the one that survives, and that's fine. But when predators abate, hypervigilance makes nervous systems degrade. So let's defuse the bomb with a code and set the frame for post-traumatic growth.
I turn my world brighter. Now the better days have arrived. I turn my world brighter. Now the better days have arrived.
Girl, you're so full of of epigenetic markers. The sins of the fathers visited on the daughters. Intergenerational trauma, perpetuated expectations, setting DNA methylated. But the cycle is limited, you get to break it every generation. That effect gets abated. Forget the sins of the great grandmas. It only lasts a couple of generations in mammals, so you can take action. Girl, you're so elastic, no concrete statue. Your neuroplastic memory is so dynamic, many benefits. Each new experience amps neurogenesis. I know you got shamed a lot, reviled and hated, and those are the pathways that got myelinated. So rewire it, baby, try to get better. Cause neurons that fire together, wired together from a safe place to chaotic adversity, generating neuroecological diversity, adaptive imperatives, wrapped and experienced. You can share this with your therapist.
Now it's time to relearn. Now the better days have arrived. I turn my world brighter. Now the better days have arrived.
Thank you for listening. That was slightly longer than I imagined it would be, but there we are. Please email me if you have any questions or anything. It's Haley Peckham. There's no Y in Haley. Just please bear that in. No Y in Haley. Haley Peckham @unimelb.edu.au. Thank you.